My name is Kath. Thank you. We are recording this session so that people later on can listen to the webinar. But yes, I am Catherine Rubiano. I'm the Bird Programs Manager for Environment for the Americas. And Kyle, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Kyle Carlson, and I'm Communications Manager here at Environment for the Americas.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking to you a little bit about the focal species that we picked for World Migratory Bird Day. There is 16 actually, but we're really going to focus on the Western Hemisphere. And then we'll mention the other birds a little bit, but we won't go too in depth with them. So we do have 11 species. These birds were actually painted by Omar Custodio, which I'm sure you guys have heard about. He's a really awesome biologist, and he's kind of a jack of all trades. But we were really lucky, and he got to draw our birds. And Kyle is gonna go ahead and start.
All right, I'll get us started with our first ambassador species for World Migratory Bird Day 2022. We'll start with the ruddy duck. Ruddy duck is a small, compact diving duck. And as you can see here in the picture, the breeding male has this bright blue bill. And you can see why it's called a ruddy duck, because the breeding male has this ruddy color, kind of this dark reddish brown, and a big white cheek patch. And you often see them with their tails kind of sticking up, which is kind of a good way to help identify them. And here we have on the next screen,
having some technical
difficulties here,
of course.
But we're going to look at comparing the male versus the female. So we have the male on the left, where you can see in breeding plumage, it has that bright blue bill and the bright ruddy color overall and the white cheek patch. It's a good way to identify this bird. On the right, we have the female in breeding plumage, which is, lacks that blue color and the ruddy color. It's a more grayish brown overall. But one way you can still identify them is they still have the tail kind of sticking up in that distinctive posture. And they also have a whitish cheek patch with kind of a brown line going through it, as you can see there. And that's another way to identify the female ruddy duck. All right, so we'll look at the range and habitat for this bird. Ruddy duck is what we kind of consider.
We can't see your screens. Am I the only one who's not seen Kyle's screens?
You should be able to see our screen. Is everyone else?
Yes, I can see the screen, Pat.
Okay.
Me too, I can see it.
Okay, so
All right.
maybe.
We'll try to see what's going on there, but
I just see Kyle on a map behind you. So his backdrop.
Oh, well, you should still be able to see maybe the way that you have it set up for the speaker kind of like view.
yeah, if you can find it's Kat's screen that will have the slides. So if you can find that one and make that one your main image. But we'll go ahead and kind of move along here. So ruddy duck is what we consider sort of medium distance migrant. And for a lot of birds in general, it's not always a black and white, like they all migrate in the same way. So some populations of ruddy duck are resident populations in parts of South America, the Caribbean, and Mexico, but they don't really migrate. But most of the ruddy ducks in the US and Canada are migrants. So you can see on the map there where the blue is the wintering range, the red is the breeding range, and yellow would be the migration between the two. And anywhere you see in purple is an area where the bird is found year round. And ruddy ducks are mostly nocturnal migrants, and they usually move in groups of 5 to 15. They'll be found in all kinds of watery habitats, and they breed in marshes and reservoirs, stock ponds, wetlands. In winter, they're still going to be found on water. They'll usually be found on larger lakes and reservoirs, maybe like in the southern US, when they're in their wintering area. You often find groups of ruddy ducks and a lot of other ducks on those large lakes and reservoirs. And next we'll look at the life history of this bird. So ruddy duck will live up to 13 years in the wild, and they'll actually build a kind of a cup-like nest, similar to how a bird, what you give your traditional nest in a cup shape. And it's usually well concealed in cattails or grasses along the water, and they'll build that out of dry vegetation. Though usually they can lay anywhere from 3 to 13 eggs, and the incubation period is 20 to 26 days. And then it's only a day until the young actually leave the nest, but then they stay with the parents for about another 6 weeks before they're truly independent. They'll feed on water, of course, and during the breeding season, they eat a lot of insects and crustaceans. They'll eat some aquatic vegetation, but that's more of what they go after in the winter. Winter, they'll have more of a vegetarian diet and eat plants and seeds and that sort of thing. It is a diving duck, like I mentioned earlier. So a lot of our ducks are either diving ducks or what we call like puddle ducks. So if you think of a mallard or another puddle duck, and you think about how when they're feeding, they'll tip up, so their tail's sticking up, and they'll just have their heads underneath, and they're just grabbing whatever food is right there below the surface of the water. Other ducks, like ruddy ducks, actually dive. So they'll go completely underwater, and they'll go to the bottom of the pond or lake floor and actually get their food from there. So that's usually what a ruddy duck will do. Sometimes they'll skim the water from the top, like you see in this image, but generally they are a diving duck. And they'll also dive to avoid predators. So if a hawk or something is overhead, they'll actually go underwater to avoid predation. So of course, our focus this year is on light pollution, and all of these birds were selected as ambassador species to help us talk about light pollution. So for each bird, we're going to talk a little bit about how light pollution impacts them and share a conservation tip for how you can help reduce light pollution. So ruddy ducks are diving ducks that mostly migrate at night, and they're vulnerable to collisions and other dangers when they're pulled off course by artificial lights, just like a lot of our songbirds and other birds. So we chose ruddy duck as a reminder that it's not just songbirds that migrate at night and are influenced by light pollution, but it also affects birds of lots of families, including some waterfowl and shorebirds. And as we share these light pollution tips, one of the things that you and all of us can really do to help is to spread the word and raise awareness about how light pollution impacts migratory birds of all kinds. So we hope that a lot of what we'll talk about today, you can incorporate into your individual World Migratory Bird Day events or on your own social media, just to help spread information about how these birds do migrate at night, and how important it is that we take steps to reduce the impacts of light pollution. And we'll wrap up each species with a few additional fun facts. So an interesting thing about ruddy duck is it actually lays the largest eggs of any duck species relative to its body size. For a fairly small duck, it lays very large eggs. The males and the females look somewhat similar during the winter.
Oh, if everybody could just make sure they're muting themselves. It sounds like someone's really partying out there, but yeah, if you mute yourselves, appreciate it. Oh, sorry.
All right. The little thing about ruddy ducks is there are fossils found that are 1,000 years old of ruddy ducks in different parts of the United States. So these ducks have been around for quite a long time. Our next species is DarkBuild Cuckoo, which is a bird that is found in South America. It looks quite similar, and in a lot of ways, it is very similar and closely related to other cuckoo species, such as YellowBuild and BlackBuild cuckoos, which are the two more common ones in the United States. The cuckoo family is quite large, and there are cuckoos of different kinds in different parts of the world. One species that is in the cuckoo family that I'm sure many are familiar with is the greater Roadrunner, which is a ground-dwelling cuckoo. But most cuckoos are tree-dwelling species like this one and found in tropical places in the Americas. So you can see there on the map that this species is found throughout much of South America. It is partially migratory, meaning kind of like we talked about with ruddy duck. Some of the populations do migrate. So some of the populations in the southern part of that range will migrate, and it is considered an austral migrant, which means it breeds in temperate areas of South America, and then it migrates north for the southern winter, which is the reverse of what we think of for a lot of our other migratory species and most of the others that we'll be talking about today, where they migrate north or south for winter. And in this case, it's in reverse. And they're found in a lot of woodland and forest-like habitats, usually in the lowlands and open woodlands, in tropical deciduous forests, and sometimes mangroves. They live about 6 years, and they breed during October, November, December. They'll build a platform-like nest with sticks, which kind of resembles a pigeon nest. It's usually in a tree or a bush. They'll lay 2 to 3 greenish blue eggs, except in Argentina, where it's usually 3 to 4 eggs. And DarkBuild cuckoo is not a brood parasite. And what we mean by that is most cuckoos, well, not most, but some cuckoos, like the Old World cuckoos, are well known for laying their eggs in the nests of other birds, which we'll talk about more later because other species do that too. But DarkBuild cuckoo is one of the cuckoos that does not do that. So they build their own nests and lay their own eggs. Their incubation period is about 10 days, which is relatively short for a bird, and their nestling period is about 1 week. They eat a lot of insects, ants, beetles, and grasshoppers. They tend to be pretty secretive as they're feeding and going about their day, so they're more commonly heard than seen. They can be quite vocal. And other cuckoo species like YellowBuild Cuckoo in the United States are also secretive. You don't see them as often as you hear them, but they can be quite vocal. In fact, the YellowBuild Cuckoo is nicknamed rain crow because they tend to vocalize right before it rains, and you can really hear them in the summer in a lot of areas of North America. So we just want to remind everyone that these birds are migrating at night, and artificial light disrupts bird migration. It pulls them off course, it attracts them, results in collisions, lots of other dangers. And we just want to remember to turn off all non-essential outdoor lights at night. And we'll talk more about other aspects of that as we go forward. I'll turn it over to Kat, talk about our next bird.
All right, so we're going to talk about the lesser Yellowlegs, which is a wading bird, a shorebird, but the shorebird is pretty different. Let's see, because you can see it in forests, and so that's something that's really interesting. It's not common. I come from living in like the islands of Hawaii, where I'm used to seeing shorebirds hanging out at beaches or at wetlands and not at, not on top of trees. So that's something that's pretty interesting about them. They are throughout the Western Hemisphere, but they are breeding kind of in that west of Alaska and just more kind of that Northern Hemisphere. For their wintering habitats, they really like those shallow wetlands, the freshwater, some mud flats you might see them at. But yeah, during breeding, they're hanging out in some open forest areas, some woodlands that might have some bogs. Oh, I wrote bogs twice, so that's fun. But yeah, they're very different, at least from what I'm used used to. They actually have a really short lifespan, which is very different. I didn't think that that was common, but I'm sure there's also other things that play a role into that. They are actively hunted in some areas of the world, and so that can probably play a bit of a role, as well as habitats have been changing, and so probably the lack of habitat could put some pressure on that. They are ground nesters, and so they will go ahead and make a little depression on the ground, and they use dry grass and leaves and moss, and it's about 4 inches wide. And their clutch size, so like they probably have about 3 to 5 eggs. It kind of depends. And then their incubation period is 22 to 23 days. They are precocial. I'm ahead of myself. They are precocial, and so what that means is that they kind of hatch pretty much ready to go. And so that's why they really only need kind of that 1 day nesting period, and then they'll kind of run around. Like it's kind of crazy to, if you've ever seen some shorebirds just running around and they're just freshly hatched. So that's really cool about them. And then I did want to mention this species does have a declining population. And so there's definitely been some more focus on conservation with them. So what do they like to eat? They like to eat invertebrates. So, you know, just like any insects, and that's land or aquatic. And then they also like to eat small fish and seeds, but that's not very common. What's really cool about them is that they have kind of like I want to call it a wide gate, but it's not usually set as a wide gate, like a high, I guess it's a high gate. So they'll go ahead and kind of stretch out their legs, one of their legs like high, and kind of move forward. Probably not the best example of lesser yellowlegs. But yeah, they move very quickly. And so what they'll do is they'll kind of jab for their prey. And then they sometimes will do like kind of a sweeping back and forth, but that's not very, it's not too common. And I think they just kind of prefer for those quick jabs. They've also been documented at night. So there's not specific data from for lesser yellowlegs, but there has been data on shorebirds, and they are traveling at night, and they do rely kind of on those dark skies to help them navigate. Another thing that is common, or that is coming to light, is that some of these shorebirds are actually feeding for longer periods of time. It sounds like a good thing, right? Because they're getting to eat some more, you know, eat a lot. But that is kind of messing up their natural rhythm. Oh, if people could just mute themselves. Thank you. Just make sure to mute yourselves. But a good tip to keep in mind is that you can turn your lights off at night to allow sandpipers and other birds to safely make their migration journey. And I did want to give you guys a fun fact. The oldest was over 4 years and 11 months. So definitely probably closer to 5 years, because they're not banded, you know, as soon as they hatch, they usually are not banded. And so this guy was probably a couple months into his life before he got banded, or maybe even longer. So that's pretty neat. And then they have a nickname called Marshpiper. They also have a French nickname, which is like the Little Knight, but I won't say it, so I'm not butchering some French. All right, and I'm going to talk also about the Markham's storm petrel. Our little elusive seabird. It is a pretty small seabird. It is in the family of storm petrels. And it is endemic to the Humboldt Current of South America, so like Chile and Peru. And so with wintering, what it's doing, it's actually heading up, or I guess not up, northward to tropical and warmer waters. And then for breeding, this is actually very recent. In 2013, they found out where they were breeding and nesting, and that's actually in a desert, which is just blows my mind. And the way that it was, they found out about this is that they were about to start mining in the, I'm gonna hopefully say it correctly, the Atacama Desert in Chile. And, you know, a surveyor found a bird and then kind of took a picture, text it to a biologist. And so that's kind of how they found out. And so they're still finding out so much information about this bird still. And so as I go on with my life history, you're going to kind of see there's some blanks, and that's just because we really don't know what's going on yet. But hopefully there's a lot of information that will be coming out in the next couple of years. So lifespan, there's limited data on that, but most storm petrels are living about 30 years. So where are they nesting? They're nesting in burrows and crevices and cavities. And those cavities are made out of salt, and that's kind of all they really have. They don't, you know, they don't put leaves, they don't put anything really in there. And they'll have one egg. And then the incubation is one of the longer incubation periods from at least the birds that we have here. And that's kind of common with seabirds, but it's average 47. And then the females and the males go ahead and take turns, which is great. And then for fledgling, there's limited data on that, but we do know that when they're ready to fly, they're heading out to sea, and so they're not sticking around in kind of that desert area. So feeding behavior, most likely it is more diurnal, but they can also feed at night. But for the most part, most seabirds, you'll see them actually like all the time, but with like a large portion of them being during the day. They are eating cephalopods and fish. So like cephalopods, like squids and stuff like that, that are coming up to the surface. And small crustaceans. And so if you remember kind of the picture that we showed earlier on the well, I guess it was the drawing that we have of the storm petrel, its wings are up in a V, and that's kind of like the position where it takes what it's feeding, which I just think that's so weird. And it'll like pitter patter its feet, kind of like stomp its feet. And that's what they're doing when they're about to like grab food. But then they'll also sometimes, if they're resting like on the water or just floating in the water, they'll go ahead and do some picking. We do actually know that this species specifically is very affected by light. And unfortunately, in some cities, they've been able, well, not been able, but they have found at least 1,000. In other cities, they found like 3,000 individuals a year. And they end up getting grounded and they can't get up, which also allows them to get eaten by cats, unfortunately get run over by cars, because they're seabirds, so they're not really made to kind of take off from the ground. They're kind of made either to take off from the water or go ahead and, you know, be able to kind of jump off like cliffs or higher areas. So they are becoming attracted to it. And then that might also be because of how the ocean looks, you know, when the moon is shining, it kind of like gleams. And so they might be getting confused with that, with the light with them. And I don't have a fun fact slide, but I did want to tell you they're part of the genus Hydrobatus, and I might be pronouncing that wrong. But that means water walkers. So yeah, they're kind of in that family, which is pretty cool. And then we'll talk a little bit about black-crowned night herons. So it's a heron. But what's really cool is the male and females, they look alike. They kind of have like that like dullish blue and gray and white. Really the only difference between male and females are that they have these breeding feathers, the little white feathers that you see, and the males are typically shorter. But juveniles look very different and can be kind of, I feel like if I would have looked at the species without knowing, it has definitely can be confused for another species. So that's pretty neat. And then sometimes you'll see, and I'll show you in some later pictures, where the eyes are a little bit, are kind of like a yellowish tint that helps kind of show, but as they get older, it turns red. They are a short distance migrant, so they're not really thought of, you know, like when you think of, I guess, black-crowned night herons, you probably don't think of them migrating very long, but there are resident populations pretty much throughout the Western Hemisphere, which is really cool. They hang out in shallow rivers and streams and swamps, just kind of, you know, very heron habitat. Let's see, so they can live a pretty long time. They can live up to 20 years. They're colony nesters, and they actually can nest with other species. So like if you, you might see them with some egrets or some ibis, like are hanging around, and they might be nesting in the same spot. And without any predators, those colonies can actually last, like, I think it's 50 years. I can't see the number right now, but okay, yes, 50 years. And then they're usually using kind of those trees, and they're not very good nest. They kind of just look like a pile of sticks. But they'll have 3 or 4 eggs. The incubation is also shared with the females and the males, and it takes about 26 days. And so they'll leave that nest. The juveniles will leave the nest, you know, after 1 month, but they'll still have like a couple weeks before they can even fly. They will eat land insects, but they'll also eat reptiles, small mammals, birds. They're pretty much opportunistic feeders and very into eating whatever. And you'll get to learn a little bit about that. But they also will protect their territories and their feeding territories. So they are kind of territorial. And they're really interesting to see when they're kind of duking it out for who gets to hang out. They do stalk, so they're kind of hunched over. That's very that is kind of the difference with them than other herons that are usually seen with like kind of the longer necks. But yeah, they kind of just look very like crouching, and then I think they look really grumpy. So they are hunting at night, and they do prefer that doing that. And so when we have artificial light and it's reflecting on the waters, that can make it difficult for them to locate prey. They are kind of a more resilient species for urbanization, and as our cities grow, they do seem to kind of be tolerable, but that does make it difficult for them. So even if, you know, not lighting kind of where, like in their area, and then also kind of talking with your community leaders and making sure that you guys are picking the right city lights for your area. So I wanted to tell you some fun facts about them. So young BlackCrowned night herons, they'll actually vomit as a defense mechanism, which is, it's good for them. And then they're also opportunistic feeders, and you can actually see them in some landfills. So remember when I said that they pretty much eat whatever, they really do. And then the last thing is that their eggs are actually green when they first come out, and then they'll turn like a pale blue. But I had the chance to work with them in Hawaii, and they were just the funniest bird, and like always looked really cranky even when I was like trying to take it to a rehab center. All right, and then we're going to talk about the burrowing owl. So when we're selecting our species, we do try to take in mind kind of all the species groups. Not every year do they get to be, like we get to pick every single species group, but we did want to have a raptor in there. Specifically, we wanted to have an owl, so we were super excited that we got to choose the burrowing owl. Some populations are migrant, so here in Colorado, we have some migrating populations, which is really cool, but they are found within North and South America. They're more commonly seen in like deserts and prairies. Agricultural lands are really good, grasslands, and they're actually pretty, there's data coming out showing that they're pretty tolerable to urbanization as well. And so where do they live? They live in burrows. They make them themselves, but usually they like ground squirrels, burrows, tortoises, prairie dogs, burrows, and they'll just kind of steal those. So they do live to be about 6 to 8 years. And then the nest, they're nesting in that burrow. And one thing that's really cool, or I guess smelly of them, is that they're using manure to kind of insulate, or not insulate, but just they put it around their burrow, and they're not too sure kind of why they're doing that, and they think it's because it could either mask the smell, or it could just be bedding, or it could also allow them to attract some insects into that area. Their clutch size is pretty big, so they'll either have from 2 to 12 eggs, so that's a long time. And their incubation is 28 to 30 days, and nestling period is 44 days, and then they'll kind of start heading out. What do they like to eat? They like to eat insects, small mammals. Sometimes they'll eat snakes. Obviously, this guy looks like he's eating a little lizard, but they are opportunistic feeders. This is what's really cool about them, is that they are a daytime owl, which is not, it's not something that we really think about. We really associate owls during the night. But they actually are very active during the day, and that'll come into play in a little bit, but they do catch the prey with their feet, which is pretty funny if you ever get a chance to see. There's also been a lot of data coming out on them. There was a research study in 2020 that kind of was looking at some of the effects of the lights in urban areas, and they saw that burrowing owls were nesting closer to streetlights because they were closer to a food source, right? So when there's a light, usually there's insects, and so they were kind of catching those insects They are, as we mentioned, active during the day. And so kind of having that artificial light is kind of doing similar things to what it does with a shorebird, where you're having them have this different activity that's normal to, that they've been doing for thousands and thousands of years. It's not too common for them to be staying out too late and, eating at this time. So it's definitely affecting them in a negative way. And it's also bringing them closer to that urban areas. So because it is an easier food source, which opens up all these different things about, there's a lot of non-native predators in these areas that they're probably not used to interacting with as much. And then you want a really good tip that you could do is turn off your exterior lights at night. You could use timers or motion sensors. That way you don't have a light running the whole time. And I thought this was pretty cool. So owlets will actually make a distress call that sounds like a rattlesnake to kind of deter predators. All right, and I'm going to hand it back to Kyle.
All right, so we're going to start looking at some passerines here. We're starting with Magnolia Warbler, which is a colorful little songbird. A lot of the warblers are colorful and very popular during this time of year as these birds are migrating north, and lots of different species are moving into the North America on the way to their breeding grounds. So if we look at the next slide here, we have kind of what Magnolia warblers look like. So the bird on the left is a breeding male, which is, if you saw a Magnolia warbler right now, it's going to look like this, very bright yellow underneath with some contrasting kind of gray and black. And you see a white wing patch on the wing, which is a good field mark. The bird on the right is kind of a first winter female. So these birds will change their plumage between breeding and non-breeding season, and the males and the females look differently. So depending on the time of year and which sex it is, there's quite a range in the appearance of Magnolia warblers and a lot of other warblers and songbirds. So you can still see some similarities where you have still a fairly bright yellow underneath and some grayish color on top. The bird on the right, the female, has more of an olive back. And you can see on the front there, it has kind of a gray neck band. That's a good field mark for this particular plumage of Magnolia warbler, which you would see in the fall or winter. So these birds, they do winter in the neotropics. It's a neotropical migrant, meaning it breeds in the temperate areas of North America and then migrates south to the tropics for the winter, and then vice versa. So right now, they're moving right through the United States in that yellow area on their way north. They do migrate at night, but sometimes this species and other birds, depending on the conditions on a particular night, usually because of wind, they'll sometimes overshoot their target or they'll get blown off course a little bit. So first thing in the morning, these birds are flying all night, and they'll usually land just right at sunrise, and they're exhausted and they're trying to, get their bearings again. And if they have been blown off course or they've overshot their target, sometimes you'll see them kind of get back up and fly again to kind of redirect and figure out where they exactly want to be, sometimes moving back south a little bit or moving closer to a better food source where they can rest and refuel throughout the day or maybe a few days before they continue on their journey. So sometimes you'll see warblers or other migratory birds in flight during the day, and it gives the impression that they're migrating during the day, but their real migration happens at night. They just do these little kind of redirection short flights that you'll sometimes see this time of year. They do breed in boreal forest, mostly in Canada, in conifer trees. And during migration, though, you'll see them in a variety of habitats, really anywhere with trees, forest edges, woodlots, parks, possibly in your backyard, as they're moving between breeding and wintering grounds. In winter, they'll usually be in forests. They can be in orchards. They'll be in a wider variety of habitat on their wintering grounds. Magnolia warblers, they usually live 3 to 6 years. Their nest is found in dense conifers, and they'll build a traditional cup-like nest, usually out of grasses and twigs. They'll usually lay 4 eggs, and their incubation period is 11 to 13 days. And then 9 to 12 days later, those nestlings will leave the nest. Magnolia warblers, so like a lot of other warblers and migrating songbirds, eat a lot of insects, which, that's one of the main reasons that these birds have to migrate in the first place, because if their primary food source is insects, and they spend all summer in North America where there are insects in summer, and as it gets colder in that area, and obviously there aren't insects around, they need to move to where there's a food source. And that's why most of these birds do migrate. It's not so much that they can't tolerate cold, it's that they need to follow their food source, which is mostly insects. So they always need to be in an area where there's plenty of insects. And they will forage in trees, they'll look under leaves. You often see the species kind of on the outer edges of a branch, constantly moving, especially this time of year when they're refueling for their next big night of migration. And like a lot of other songbirds, these warblers do migrate at night. They do need a dark sky to safely navigate. And one thing we can do to help reduce these impacts of light pollution is to make sure our lighting is illuminating the ground only and not shining up, and to use shields so that the light is shining down and not up into the sky, where it can be more of a distraction and disturbance to these birds. And one interesting fact about Magnolia Warbler, and this applies to a lot of other songbirds, is that cowbirds, and here we have a picture of a brown-headed cowbird, they'll sometimes lay their eggs in warbler nests. So cowbirds, like we talked about with some of the cuckoos earlier, they don't build their own nests, and they'll lay their eggs in other birds' nests, which will require, like let's say a cowbird lays its egg in a warbler's nest. The warbler will either recognize that it's not one of its own eggs and throw it out, but what happens more often is the egg will hatch, and then along with the other birds, so you'll have 2 or 3 Magnolia Warbler chicks with 1 cowbird chick, and the parent just goes by instinct and feeds all of the young. The problem is that the cowbird is going to be 3 to 4 times the size of the warbler. So sometimes this means that it takes more food, it'll overcrowd the nest, and it'll knock out some of the warblers. And this can be a problem for some of these species for their reproduction success, because of this kind of pressure from this parasitic bird that shows up in the nest. So that's something that is a bit of a problem for Magnolia warblers and a couple of our other species, particularly in those boreal areas. Next, we have another warbler, Wilson's warbler. So this is another small, colorful songbird. It's even smaller than the Magnolia warbler. Wilson's warbler is kind of even for a warbler, it's pretty small and petite. They're very active and energetic. Their behavior is more like a kinglet in a lot of ways than a warbler. They're constantly moving and fidgeting and kind of flicking their wings. I think they sort of have almost a wren-like shape and posture to them. It doesn't show so much in this picture, but they're quite round, and their tail is kind of relatively short, and just the way they kind of hold themselves kind of looks like a wren. And this is a breeding male. It's fairly bright yellow with a black cap. The female and the young will look similar, except instead of that black cap, the olive color on the head will just extend over that area. So they're lacking the black color. And they kind of have this beady eye look. The eyes are kind of big and dark relative to the size of their head and their body. So it kind of gives them that kind of cute wren-like look for a warbler. So even if you see one in like a female or in non-breeding plumage where it's just all yellow, that's a way to kind of identify them as just their shape and their posture and kind of that big black eye compared to other yellow warblers. They are a medium to long distance migrant. As you can see there, they don't go super far south for the winter, but they will go south of the US border for the most part. That's a few will overwinter in kind of on the Gulf Coast, but most go to Mexico and to Central America. Again, they do migrate at night. They breed in mountain meadows, and they're usually associated with water at all times of year. Their primary breeding areas are around ponds, lakes, bogs, streams, that kind of thing. In winter, they'll be found in a wider variety of habitat types, but still usually associated with water. They'll sometimes be in woodlands or suburban areas even, and possibly your backyard. They'll live about 6 years, and most Wilson's warblers nest on the ground. There are some exceptions in some areas where they've been found to be nesting a few feet off the ground. They'll lay anywhere from 2 to 7 eggs, but average is 4 eggs for their clutch size. Their incubation period is 10 to 13 days, and 9 to 11 days later is when the young do leave the nest. And like I said before, Wilson's warblers are very active and constantly moving. They mostly eat insects and spiders, and then you'll see them like gleaning and hovering around leaves. You'll sometimes see them sallying, which means they'll fly out and grab a flying insect and come back down to their perch, kind of like a flycatcher. But they're always moving. They're constantly fidgeting. And you'll compare to other warbler species, you'll see them usually feeding at the low to middle levels of the forest. So usually eye level or below. Whereas when you think of some of our other warblers, like maybe a Blackbirdian warbler or a Cape May warbler, they're usually really high at the treetops and maybe hard to see. But this is a bird that you'll usually see, like I said, eye level or below, and usually around water. So another reminder that artificial light attracts and disorients these warblers and a lot of these other migratory birds. It leads them to areas where they're more vulnerable to collisions and other dangers. They're literally attracted to the lights. So when we have lots of bright lights, it increases the chances that they're going to end up in maybe urban areas where, as we've said, for some of these other birds, there are non-native predators, there's windows, there are cars, and lots of dangers for them. So one thing we can do is to close blinds and curtains at night to keep the indoor lights from shining out, impacting birds, because it's not just our exterior lights, but even indoor lights will shine out, attract birds' windows, or just have that light shining out, which is distracting them and disturbing them and pulling them off course. So if we close blinds and curtains at night, it keeps those lights from shining out. Interesting fact about the Wilson's warbler is they will do a broken wing display to lure predators away from a nest. So a lot of other species will do this too. Like you might think of a killdeer or another shorebird. If you approach where one of these birds is nesting, the parent will pretend to have a broken wing and kind of like should get your attention, is distract you and pull you away from the nest to make it look like it's an easy target. So the predator will go after the parent instead of the nest. And then they'll lure them away, and then when they get a little bit away from the nest, they'll fly off to safety. Like a Steller's jay or a snake, or one of the parents will often perform this broken wing display to lure them away, which is interesting thing that to think of a little warbler doing that, like you would see in a shorebird. All right, so now we have Swainson's thrush for our next species. Swainson's thrush is a brown forest-dwelling bird. One thing that helps to kind of separate it from other thrushes is it has that kind of buffy color in the face that you can see there on the left. And
Oh, sorry.
That's fine. So this is a long distance migrant, as you can see on the map. They breed in these boreal areas in North America, and they will move down into Central and fairly far down into South America to winter in the tropics. They breed in forests, often near water, and during migration, you can see them in a variety of areas, but usually still in more forested woodland type habitats. And they'll winter in a variety of places from high elevation cloud forests to lowland areas, usually with bushes and trees near streams. Swainson's warbler, or Swainson's thrush, sorry, can live 8 to 10 years. The oldest on record was over 12 years old. They will nest in the forest understory, and they'll build a cup-like nest. Their clutch size is 1 to 5 eggs, and their incubation period is 10 to 14 days, and about the same time frame later is when the young leave the nest. They will feed usually near or on the ground, and they'll eat mostly insects during the spring and summer, and a lot of fruit in the fall and winter. When they're coming back through during fall migration, you'll really see them chowing down on berries. Any fruiting tree will usually have Swainson's thrushes in them during fall migration. And sometimes they're usually foraging on the ground for food, but sometimes they'll dive from a perch to catch prey, kind of like a bluebird. And another light pollution tip is, artificial light disrupts bird migration. So if we can install outdoor lights with timers or motion sensors, it keeps that usage to a minimum so you don't have a light shining all night. Interesting thing about a Swainson's thrush is thrushes in general are known for their songs, very musical and loud singing. But Swainson's thrush is the only one whose song goes up in pitch. It kind of spirals up versus down like our other thrushes. And thrushes in general are unique for songbirds in that they have a double voice box, so they can actually sing 2 notes at once, which they're literally singing a duet with themselves and harmonizing. So that's why when you hear a thrush song and it sounds particularly melodious and musical, it's because they are singing 2 notes that really are harmonizing with each other. So they're singing partial chords, which is really fascinating and unique in the songbird world.
All right, and then we are at our last bird, I believe, right?
Second to last.
Second to last. Okay, so I'll try to go through this pretty quick because I know we're running out of time, but I have the Western Tanager. So it can be very different. The female and the male. The female is to your left. So it's kind of that dull color. That male has that red head that's like very distinctive of what you think of as like a Western Tanager, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that red head in a little bit. It is a medium distance migrant, and it is migrating at night. When you're looking at some of the habitat that they're using is usually forests and mixed woodlands. And actually, I believe some of the wintering areas that they're using is kind of those urban areas. So those parks, those gardens, those orchards is kind of where you see them. And then when they're arriving to their breeding grounds, the males are usually going to arrive a bit earlier than the females. So they live for an average of 8 years, and they are nesting in the trees. And they have kind of that more traditional passerine or songbird kind of nest cup. And the females are the ones that are building those nests, and it takes about 4 to 5 days. And they're using all kinds of materials. But the clutch size is usually from 3 to 5. And then the female is doing all the work incubating, and they're going to incubate those eggs for about 13 days. And then once the birds hatch, they'll hang out in that nest for about 11 to 15 days before they start kind of exploring the world. They do eat insects. They have a common behavior where they clip the wings of like dragonflies and other, I think this is actually a mayfly, so they'll take those wings. But they also eat fruit, and that's going to be more common when they're wintering. For foraging, they kind of just go around and will be plucking at twigs and flowers and berries. And they also will kind of stand still and then do a side to side search for some insects. And with this conservation tip, it is trying to use warm light. Blue light is not very good for most bird species. It's a bit less disruptive. So just kind of being cautious. I know, especially in the last couple years, we kind of got the LED lights and they're all kind of that blue, very not natural color. And so changing those lights into a warm color. And something that's really cool about those red feathers, with most birds, the red feathers usually come from plant pigment. So it comes from them eating, a plant that helps them produce a pigment that makes them red. But this one actually, with the Western Tanager, they're actually consuming insects and creating that pigment from those insects. And then the Western Tanager is actually one of the most farthest traveling north tanagers. And then another really cool thing about them is that the males will sing nonstop, just when they're establishing their breeding territories. So you'll hear them a lot kind of on those territory edges. And I will pass it over to Kyle.
All right, so the last bird we're going to focus on today is Baltimore Oriole, which is a really striking fluorescent orange bird. And next slide, we'll see the male versus female. So the bird on the left is the male in breeding plumage, which is that bright orange with high contrasting black head and wings. The bird on the right is a female Baltimore Oriole in breeding plumage. So it's still pretty brightly colored, just not quite as a fluorescent orange, more of a yellowish orange. And the head and the back there, that dark color, can be quite variable. So this is kind of an average one in the picture, but that brownish black can be so light that it kind of looks all yellow orange, or it can be almost as dark as a male, but it won't be quite as complete and dark as the male. So these birds are medium to long distance migrants, and they do migrate at night. They breed in woodlands and open areas. The image there is like a pretty typical area where you'd expect to see or hear a Baltimore Oriole. You often find them at like the edge of a woodland area rather than deep in the forest. Sometimes they'll be near water. They tend to be near water. During migration, they'll show up in a variety of places with trees, and you can often find them in urban parks and quite often in backyards. And winter, you can find them in backyard gardens and hedges and forest edges. These birds can live up to 11 years, and the female, after selecting a mate, will usually choose the nesting site. And an Oriole nest is unique, and you can see here in the picture, it weaves kind of a hanging basket of a nest. It's kind of like a sock-like hanging nest, which is a unique looking nest. So if you see them, they'll be suspended from a tree, and it looks like a kind of a hanging basket. The clutch size is 4 to 5 eggs. The incubation period is around 12 days. The female incubates alone. And the nestling period is 12 to 13 days. At the end of the breeding season, the males will leave first, and then the females, and then the juveniles will move out in small flocks of 5 to 10 individuals. Those are the last ones you'll see at the end of the breeding season before they migrate south. So Baltimore Orioles will eat mostly insects, lots of caterpillars, and sometimes fruit or nectar, especially in winter. So this is a reason why if you can put out fruit, put out oranges to attract orioles. If you're in their migration area or their breeding area in the United States or Canada, if you put out an orange right when they're coming back, because they've been in the tropics feeding on fruit all winter, so that's the food source they're used to. So when they first get back and they see those oranges, they're attracted to that, and that's what they'll feed on for a few weeks. But then they'll move on to insects, which is what they focus on during the actual breeding season. And they'll comb through branches, flowers, and fruit to find insects and to get the fruit and the nectar directly. Sometimes they'll grab prey from the air. This is a species that is commonly found as a result of light pollution and window collisions. It seems to be particularly susceptible to this. And our conservation tip is to reduce your light usage in general and to always use the minimum wattage necessary for the task at hand. So if you do have to have lighting, security lighting, or anything like that, always use the bare minimum. So at least if there is a light, it's not too bright and less likely to attract birds to harmful areas or buildings and windows and that sort of thing. And like I said, you can attract Baltimore Orioles with fruit. It's fun to create a fruit feeder or just simply place an orange, like stick it on a broken off tree branch or nail it to a fence post, and they'll come to that. So they tend to feed high up in trees. So if you have a fruit feeder at eye level or below, it's an easier way to see them, especially this time of year. If you're in North America and they're moving through right now, you can probably attract them with fruit. And if you're in their wintering area, then you can certainly do that because they really feed on fruit throughout their non-breeding season. And they do eat a lot of insects, and they help eliminate pests like gypsy moth and fall webworms and tent caterpillars. So they're a very beneficial species in that regard.
All right, so we're just gonna quickly go through these. Kyle, if you're okay,
Sure.
Kyle, go over them, not over them, but just kind of mention them really quickly. Thank you so much for all of you guys who have stayed. We really appreciate everyone hanging out. So I will pass it over to Kyle.
So yeah, just very quickly here in closing. So the species we just went through are the 11 ambassador species for the Americas World Migratory Bird Day. But World Migratory Bird Day is global outside the Americas, and we have partners that we work with in other flyways. So we have a few species that we've selected to represent those birds that will be coming out soon on a global poster that will show each of the flyways and some birds outside of the Americas. So just quickly here, we have Cory shearwater, which is a seabird of the Atlantic Ocean. We have a common eider, which is a large sea duck of the Northern Hemisphere. Redwing is a thrush. You can see there why it's called a redwing, and it is common across Eurasia. Short-tailed shearwater is a seabird of the Pacific and Arctic Oceans, highly migratory, and is the most abundant seabird in Australian waters. The fairy pita is a small, colorful bird of Asia. And last but not least, we have the cinnamon bittern, which is a small heron of tropical and subtropical Asia.
All right, and this last slide, for some of you guys, we will drop our information, me and Kyle. We don't have it up here, but these are amazing coordinators that work throughout the Western Hemisphere to make World Migratory Bird Day happen. So we have Miguel, that's helping with South America, and Laura from the Caribbean, Leticia for Central America, and Daniela in Mexico. So we'll leave this on for a second. And we just want to thank you so much for coming and listening. I know it was a lot of information, and I'm sure there's so much more information that you can find about these species. So we encourage you to do that. We'll stick around for a little bit to kind of listen and see if you guys have any questions. And we'll try to answer them as best as we can.